today we are going to look into the strategic form game and extensive game with suitable examples. So the topic of our discussion of today will be, we'll try to distinguish between strategic form game and extensive game. So mainly we are also going to give some examples, some suitable examples of game theory that will actually represent this strategic form game and extensive game. So let me write the name of the topic for today: strategic form game and extensive game. So at first we are going to talk about the strategic form game. So basically this strategic form game and extensive game both are two ways of analyzing the interaction between players. So if I talk about the strategic form game at the beginning, the first topic that we are going to discuss is strategic form game, then we are going to discuss the extensive game. So let me discuss about the strategic form game at first. So strategic form game, it is represented by a matrix that are outlined the players, and suppose we have I'm going to give the example, but let me tell it that strategic form game is basically represented by a matrix. It is represented by a matrix, and that matrix actually outlines the players. So it is represented by a matrix that outlines the players, their strategies, and the payoff of each combination, the payoffs for each combination of strategies. So it is represented by a matrix that outlines the players, their strategies, and obviously the payoff. So here what was I saying, that strategic form game was represented by matrix that outlines the players, their strategies, and the payoffs. So now if we give an example, or if we try to give an example of the strategic form game, then the prisoner's dilemma that we know, the game for the prisoner's dilemma is basically a very perfect example, a very proper example of the strategic form game. So let me tell some points about the strategic form game before going into the example. Strategic form game is basically suitable for games where players make their decisions simultaneously without the knowledge of others' decisions. So suppose there are two players. So player 2 doesn't know about the decision of player 1, as well as player 1 doesn't know about the decision taken by player 2. So both of the players are unknown about the others' decisions, and they make their decisions simultaneously. Each of the players make their decision or take their decision simultaneously. So if we take an example now, let us define it with an example. So for this example we have two players, and we are going to discuss, we are going to take the example of prisoner's dilemma here. Simplified version of prisoner's dilemma is basically the most proper example of the extensive form game. So we are going to discuss the prisoner's dilemma as the example of extensive form game. So we have two players. The players are basically the two criminals. So two criminals are the players in this game, and their strategies. Each player can cooperate or deny. These are the strategies for each of the players. So if I write the strategies, then there can be two strategies for each of the players. They can cooperate or deny. These are the two options available to each of the player. They can cooperate or deny. And what are the payoffs? The payoffs are basically the outcome based on the combination of strategies chosen by each players. So payoff matrix, if we define the payoff matrix, then payoff matrix looks like this. Let me write the payoff matrix. So in this part we are taking player 1 confessing, player 1 denying, and here we are taking player 2 confessing and player 2 denying. So when player 1 and player 2 both are confessing, both are getting 3 years of imprisonment. Player 1 is getting 3 years of imprisonment and player 2 is also getting 3 years of imprisonment. When player 2 is confessing but player 1 is denying, then player 1 is actually getting 5 years of imprisonment, and player 2 is confessing and he is getting 0 years of imprisonment. That is, he is getting he is actually not being punished here. When player 2 is denying and player 1 is confessing, so obviously player 1 is confessing, player 2 is denying, so player 1 will be completely free and player 2 will get 5 years of imprisonment. Similarly, when player 1 and player 2 both are denying, player 1 is denying as well as player 2 is denying, they are getting 1 year of imprisonment each. So now it is up to the players and they don't know each other's decision. Player 1 doesn't know about the decision taken by player 2 and player 2 doesn't know about the decision taken by player 1. So what should they do? So let us discuss about it. So we know that if both cooperate, that means if both are cooperating, then they are getting the payoff of 3. Each of them are getting 3 years of imprisonment. If player 1 cooperates, so that means if player 1 cooperates, that means we are here actually. Player 1 is cooperating and player 2 is denying. So that means player 1 is cooperating and player 2 is denying. That means we are here. This is the payoff. So in that payoff, player 1 gets 0 years of imprisonment. That means he is free. But player 2 is getting 5 years of imprisonment. Similarly, player 1 denies and player 2 confesses. That means we are here. This is the payoff matrix. In this case, player 1 is getting 5 years of imprisonment but player 2 gets free as payoff. And if you are here, that means player 1 is denying and player 2 both are denying. Each are getting payoff as 1. That means both are getting 1 year of imprisonment. So this is basically the prisoner's dilemma. This is the example of prisoner's dilemma, and this is also the example of extensive form game. So we have actually understood about the prisoner's dilemma and we have also understood about the extensive form game. We have actually understood about the strategic form game here. We have actually understood about the strategic form game here. I may have told sometimes in my video that I may have mistakenly told it that it is extensive form game, but it is strategic form game. If I have committed that mistake, then I am extremely sorry for that. So in the strategic form game, we have understood here that what is strategic form game, and we have also observed an example of the strategic form game, that is the prisoner's dilemma. Now we are going to look into the extensive form game. So extensive form game. What is the extensive form game and what will be the example of extensive form game? That we are going to look into the next part. So an extensive form game is basically represented by a decision tree that shows the sequence of moves or choices available to each of the players at each decision point and the payoffs at the end of each sequence of moves. That means this game is basically suitable when the players are making the decision at different points of time and they have the knowledge of the previous actions, that what the other players are doing or what the other players has actually done. They have the knowledge about it. So there is a key difference that is arising in between the extensive form game and strategic form game, that in the strategic form game the players are unknown about each other's decision, but in the extensive form game the players are actually known about each other's decision, and the player who is making a decision knows about the decision taken by the other player, because they are making the decisions in different time points, not together. So obviously not together at the same time point. So obviously if I write the definition of extensive form game, so it is actually represented by a decision tree. So it is represented by a decision tree, and I will show you that decision tree obviously here. So it is represented by a decision tree, and that decision tree is basically showing the sequence of moves that shows sequence of moves choices available at each decision point, choices available at each decision point, and obviously the payoffs at the end of each sequence of moves. And the payoffs, you may write just and the payoffs. So basically in the extensive form game we are having a decision tree, and that decision tree will show you the sequence of moves, choices available at each decision point, and the payoffs. So that's all. So and I have also told you that this type of game is basically when each player is having the knowledge of others' decision. Each player is actually having the knowledge of others' decision, and they are making their decisions at different time point. They are making their decisions or taking their decisions, you may say, taking decisions at different time point. So obviously this is it. Now if I take an example of this, so suppose if I take a sequential version of prisoner's dilemma. Okay, so if I want to take a sequential version of the prisoner's dilemma, let me write it. I am taking actually here the example for the extensive form game. So consider a sequential version of prisoner's dilemma. In the earlier form of prisoner's dilemma, it was the prisoner's dilemma represented by a matrix. Now we are going to take the prisoner's dilemma, which will be represented by a sequential form or sequential version. So we have the sequential version of prisoner's dilemma. Now the point is, suppose we have, obviously here also we have two players, two criminals, both of the players are two criminals, so all of the things are same. Players are two criminals, and strategies, they can cooperate or they can deny. These are the two strategies available to them. They can cooperate or they can deny. Similarly the moves, here from this point we have a difference that is coming up. In this point, in the earlier game, that means when you are talking about the strategic form game, both of the players are actually unaware, completely unaware about each other's moves. Player 1 doesn't know about the move of player 2, but player 2 also doesn't know about the player 1's moves. So they are basically completely unknown about each other's move, and they are moving at the same point of time. They are making the decision at the same point of time. So no player is actually being able to observe the other player's decision, so that he can make himself, or he can actually present himself a better position. That is not possible for him, because he is not being able to know the other player's decision. But in this case, in the extensive form game, any of the player, that means suppose if I take player 1 or player 2, one of the player is actually moving fast. Then when that player moves fast, so the other player is getting the opportunity to decide that which payoff is going to give him a better position. So suppose if I take that player 1 moves fast. If player 1 moves fast, followed by player 2, player 2 will move second. That means player 2 has the opportunity and option to observe the move taken by player 1, and he can select the payoff as per his will, that he can actually make the payoff that is going to give him a better position, or he can actually select the payoff that is going to give him a better position. So player 2 moves second, followed player 2 move second, followed by player 2 who if I write it properly, right, then player 1 moves first, followed by player 2, so followed by player 2 who moves who actually knows, who then knows player 1's choice or player 1's payoff, and then player 2 moves, and then player 2 moves. So if I now represent this tree, if I want to represent this game, then how can I represent? So let me see the representation. So player 1's move, suppose player 1 chooses C or D, what happens? At first we will take that player 1 is moving fast. So player 1's move, player 1 may choose C or player 1 may choose D. We don't know what is player 1 choosing. So player 1 may choose C or D. What will be player 2's move? Let us analyze that. So player 2's move. Now here two important aspect is coming. One is if player 1 chooses C. Let me see the matrix. We can take the help of the matrix which we have drawn in the earlier course portion. So you can take the help of the matrix here also. Suppose if player 1 chooses to confess, which option is better for player 2? Player 2 can obviously, player 2 can choose C or D. That is the two option available to player 2. Obviously player 2 will choose D. That is very clear because player 2 will choose to confess as well, because if player 2 chooses deny, player 1 has confessed. If player 2 chooses to deny, then player 2 will have 5 years of imprisonment. So why will he choose that? He will obviously choose to confess. Both of them are getting 3 years of imprisonment. 3 years of imprisonment is better than 5 years of imprisonment. So player 2 has two options. He can choose C or D, but he will obviously choose D. But we will write that player 2, if player 1 chooses C, player 2 have two options. Player 2 can choose C, which is going to give him 3 and 3 years of imprisonment for both, and or player 2 can choose D, which is going to give him 5 years of imprisonment and 0 years of imprisonment for player 1. Similarly, player 1 chooses D. That is, we have considered here that if player 1 chooses C, then these two things can happen. If player 1 chooses C, that is player 1 chooses to confess, then these two things can happen. Player 2 can choose C or D. Obviously he will choose D, but that is not the point that we want to mean. We are actually representing the options available or the choices available to player 2. So player 2 has these two choices available if player 1 chooses C. Now if player 1 chooses D, so if player 1 chooses D, player 2 have two options still. Obviously, if we see the matrix also, if player 1 chooses if player 1 chooses D, player 2 has two options. He can confess or he can deny. So he has two options. So player 2 chooses maybe C, that is going to give him 5 years of imprisonment for player 1 and 0 years of imprisonment for player 2, or he can deny, that is 1 and 1 years of imprisonment for both. So these are the two options available for player 2. Here we are just discussing the options or choices available to player 2 after watching or observing the choice made by player 1. So these are the two choices available for player 2 after watching or observing the choice of player 1. So if we want to represent it by a visual tree, so this will be the visual tree. Player 1 can choose, can confess or can deny. We have player 2 here. Player 2 is observing all this. After observing this, player 2 can do two things. He can confess or deny, and if player 1 denies, player 2 can do the same thing. He can confess or deny. So if player 1 chooses to confess, player 2 can confess and deny. These are the two options available to him. If player 1 chooses to deny, player 2 has two options available: confess or deny. Now what will be the punishments for that? If player 2 confesses here, so the punishment will be 3 years of imprisonment for both, because both are confessing. Player 1 is confessing, player 2 is confessing. If player 1 is confessing, player 2 is denying here, then the matrix will be 0, 5. That is, player 1 is getting 0 years of imprisonment, but player 2 is getting 5 years of imprisonment. I feel it is done here. And the next part. For the next part, let me erase it. If player 1 denies and player 2 confesses, then we have 5, 0. That is, player 1 getting 5 years of imprisonment and player 2 is getting 0 years of imprisonment. And if player 2 denies and player 2 and player 1 both denies, player 1 denies, player 2 denies, then we have 1, 1, that is 1 years of imprisonment for both. So this is the visual tree representation, or representation of the example of extensive form game in a tree form, or visualized in a tree form. So if I have to just write the differentiations more compactly here, so I may write the differentiations. In this part I am going to write the strategic form game, and in this part I can write extensive form game. So what are the differentiation that I can write? Strategic form game uses matrix approach. I have told these differences also. And extensive form game uses decision tree. The decision tree that we have drawn in this 13th slide. So it is decision tree for the extensive form game. And the strategic form game is assuming simultaneous decision making. That means each criminal doesn't know about other decision. They are making their decision on the basis of their will, and they don't know about the decision of other criminal. So that's why they are not going to influence their decision, and their decision will not be influenced by other criminals' decision, because they don't have any idea about other criminals' decision. So this is basically simultaneous decision making. Simultaneous decision making means they don't have idea about the other criminals' decision. And so this is simultaneous decision making, and this is sequential decision making. That means other criminal knows about the decision taken by the other one. So both of the criminals are actually, or each criminal is actually aware, or any of the criminal is actually aware about the decision taken by the other criminal. So that is sequential decision making. Here in our case, criminal 2 or player 2 is actually completely aware about the decision taken by player 1. So he can change his decision accordingly. So this is the sequential decision making, that player 2 knows, or player 2 have the idea about the decision taken by player 1. So this is what we call sequential decision making. Sequential decision making. So this is the question that we have solved here today, that distinguish between strategic form game and extensive form game.